Welcome to Mentally Healthy Lifestyles. Today you are going to learn about how you can go from trauma to transformation and empower your mentally healthy lifestyle. So what is trauma? Trauma is any event that is experienced as overwhelming, and it's difficult, it's challenging, and it typically overcomes your normal coping mechanisms. So a traumatic event can be just about anything. But the key is that it overwhelms your body, it overwhelms your mind, it overwhelms your brain. We can now begin to understand how professionals categorize traumas. Traumas are typically categorized into two areas: big T trauma and small t trauma. What is the difference? Well, the fundamental difference between them: in a big T trauma, your life is at stake, your existence is at stake. Whereas in a small t trauma, your life is okay, and while it may be a traumatic experience, your existence is not in danger. So those are the big T traumas and small t traumas that you may or may not have heard about. Let's talk about a couple examples for each. In a big T trauma, you may think of some of the more awful things that somebody can experience, such as hostage situation, perhaps being in a car accident. Also, you may think of natural disasters. These are all large-scale events that can be considered big T traumas. If you're impacted by them, your life is at stake. So what then is a small t trauma? Well, as I said, small t traumas don't have your life at stake. Your existence is not at stake. In these instances, a job loss, a loss of a relationship, a pet, other types of losses that can be experienced throughout life, which can be extremely traumatic, extremely overwhelming. So now let's talk about your biopsychosocial model. Again, that BPS model that we've been using here on our channel, it's what all helping professionals use. And again, this BPS model, it considers your biology, your psychology, and the social environment of yourself. So now that you know about what trauma is and the types of traumas, we're going to now begin to go into how we experience trauma, but most importantly, how you can recover from trauma. But before I go there, I just want to share briefly about my traumatic experience without traumatizing anyone. When I was 15, I experienced sexual trauma, and I lived with it unaware for 15 years. And it wasn't until I was in my graduate program as a social work student that I began to figure out how to address that trauma. And what we are going to talk about now are the same processes that I went through to heal my trauma and end up at transformation, just as you will. So what are the stages of trauma? In the classic book, Trauma and Recovery from Judith Herman, she identifies 3 stages of recovery. Now, when I talk about these stages of recovery, you may hear them in different ways, they may be experienced differently, but in general, this is the way that you can begin to think about stages of recovery when it comes to healing your trauma. Those stages are safety, remembrance and mourning, and reconnection. So now I just want to talk briefly about each of those, and then we will continue on our path towards transformation. So let's say you've experienced a big T trauma and a tree's fallen on your vehicle, and now you are just terrified to get back into a vehicle, or even maybe afraid of trees. There may be even other instances that have affected you by this trauma. So when we go into this first stage of recovery with safety, it's really important that we restore a sense of safety to the person and their sense of well-being. Because again, if you don't feel safe, how can you really function? How can you do things that are going to support your mentally healthy lifestyle? You may be afraid to go out places, and that could prevent you from living the quality of life that you want and you so desperately need. Second, we're going to look at remembrance and mourning. This stage of recovery is heavier because we begin to start to reflect. We may take into account what has occurred, what we've lost as a result, but really, again, focusing on recovery, right? The point is not to stay in these places. We're en route to transformation. So this is merely one step in that route. And when we look at remembrance and mourning, it can be a distressing time. It can be sad, but it is ultimately a necessary part. Staying with the vehicle and the tree example, if you will, one of the things to remember in that example is that maybe before that person was fine and okay and had no worries. But now they have to go through that process, they have to remember what happened, and now they have to mourn the fact that, getting in a vehicle, being around trees, it's different now. Things are changed, okay? So that's just part of the stages of recovery. Then we arrive at that third place of recovery, which is reconnection. Reconnection with everything. It's reconnection with your body, reconnection with your brain and your thoughts, and even reconnection about how you feel in the world, reconnection to other human beings. Because when you experience a trauma, it can really damage and impact the way you relate to the entire world around you, as well as yourself. Now you're aware of these three stages of recovery, which are safety, remembrance and mourning, and reconnection. But how do you go through those stages? It comes down to finding a professional to help you work through your trauma, help you treat your trauma. When it comes to finding a professional to work with, one of the most important things is that you feel comfortable. Because if you don't feel comfortable with the person you're working with, how are you going to make any progress? You want to make sure that person is professional. You want to make sure that they are curious, they're interested in you and your story, and that while it is okay to learn about a therapist's experience with trauma treatments, as Bessel van der Kolk states in his book, it is inappropriate and unethical for a therapist to share the details. So while it's important to find somebody that may have experienced trauma as well as recovery, you want to make sure you're working with a safe individual, somebody that cares about you, you care about them, and is not using the time to just share about their traumatic stories and their traumatic events. Finding a therapist may be easier for some, may present challenges. What's important is that you begin looking. You can identify clinics in your community, local hospitals, and there are even organizations such as NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI.org you can go to, and there's tons of information. They're one of our greatest partners, and we love to send our viewers there, and we love to continue to work and support the work they do. We're going to talk more about NAMI later. However, they focus on advocacy at the national, the state, and local levels, helping individuals, families, and communities who are struggling with mental illness. An invaluable resource for any of our viewers, especially if you experience trauma and want to learn more about how you can find a therapist that works for you. So now that you're aware of what a trauma is, the types of trauma, stages of recovery, and finding a therapist, you may be wondering, well, what about PTSD? You may have heard of PTSD. It stands for post-traumatic stress disorder. What I need you to know is that PTSD is not something everybody gets. It's not something everybody experiences. As a matter of fact, it's not even a guarantee that you'll get it. What determines that? Lots of things. There are two things that we know from Bessel van der Kolk in his amazing book, The Body Keeps the Score. And those two things are social support and the ability to turn off the emergency response system. So for example, in a situation where maybe you've experienced a small T and you've lost a pet, these are awful experiences. Pets are part of the family. And so if you're able to have that social support and have that consoling individual and let you know, hey, you're okay, it's gonna be okay, and then you can begin to shut off those stress hormones, begin to shut off that emergency response, that is going to decrease the likelihood of experiencing PTSD. The same can be said for other instances, whether it's a big T or other small T's. And again, what we also need to concern ourselves with is our time of trauma, and that refers to when it happened and how often it has happened. So for example, if a child experiences a traumatic event, say abuse in the household, that is very different of a different experience than an adult experiencing a similar trauma in the household, where presumably that adult can leave, find social support and other resources. So again, timing of trauma matters, and how many times a certain trauma has occurred also matters. Perhaps you've heard of complex PTSD. But that complex post-traumatic stress disorder refers to when people have experienced repeat traumas. So, for example, we have people that have experienced human trafficking. We have people that have experienced repeat exposure to combat, and also a number of small t traumas can all add up to this experience of having complex post-traumatic stress disorder, because again, it's about the repeat. And this will definitely make the PTSD a lot more complicated. So now that you know all of this about trauma, let's continue our route towards transformation. Now that you've worked and found your mental health professional or therapist to support you in that journey, let's consider types of treatments that are specifically targeted for people that have experienced trauma, dealing with trauma, and recovering from trauma. In Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, he outlines 6 limbic system therapies that support the recovery process of trauma and healing from trauma. Before I describe those 6, I want to mention a little bit about the limbic system, what that is and why it's relevant to trauma healing and trauma treatment. The limbic system is an area inside your brain that is mostly responsible for emotions, fear, safety, memory, and while it's not so closely associated with your executive thinking functions, certainly those are incorporated into the limbic system. After all, the brain is like the most amazing thing we've discovered in the universe. There's no way your brain is letting any piece not participate. When we experience a trauma, the area of our brains that are affected reside in this limbic system. They are our emotional brains, and they are our brains that deal with memory. Because when we deal with post-traumatic stress disorders, when we deal with trauma, again, we're dealing with that sense of danger. We're dealing with memories. And sometimes if a trauma has been so bad or too soon before we're able to form memories, such as in childhood, what they call childhood amnesia. That is, we don't form memories, or at least the explicit recall memories that many adults have. But the point is that this emotional part of your brain is responsible for safety and assessing and interacting, and all of these things are deeply impacted by trauma. And part of behaving in a healthy way, in a productive way with others and with yourself, really entails the ability to kind of keep that emotional brain, that sense of safety, kind of stable and going and just continually operating in the background. Because when nothing's happened, nothing's really getting that attention. And you can spend most of your time in the frontal part of your brain, thinking, having thoughtful discussions, and so forth. These limbic system therapies are designed to treat your emotional brain, to treat your memories, as well as to help reintegrate memories and hopefully reintegrate yourself into the world around you. So now let's look at what those 6 limbic system therapies are, and again, we'll consider each of them. The first one is dealing with hyperarousal. As anybody who's experienced trauma will let you know, after the fact, you are hyper-aroused and you're even kind of maybe a little more skittish and a little more observant, and parts of your brain and body are more so responding in this hyper-aroused way. Again, these can be products of the trauma. And how can you live a healthy life if you're constantly on edge, on this hyper-arousal, hyper-alert? And that's some of the things that you hear about with people with PTSD, hypervigilance. Going into therapies that specifically target hyperarousal is one of the limbic system therapies you're going to want to pay attention to. The second, mindfulness, or as Bessel says, no mind without mindfulness. Part of mindfulness is the ability to hover over one's experience, use that observing part of your brain, that frontal part of your brain, so that you can determine whether incoming information or upcoming information is a threat or safe. You cannot do this if your brain has been now biased because of trauma, because of a traumatic incident or event. Any information coming in will be biased towards this danger, towards this trauma. But if we develop mindfulness, we can then develop the tools and skill set to help us stay calm, to help us respond mindfully, as well as use some of those techniques from mindfulness, such as returning our attention, not judging ourselves, and understanding that we are developing skills that will help us cope, but also help us thrive. So mindfulness, again, is going to be an area that targets that limbic system, and that's going to be crucial to recovering from PTSD and trauma in general. So now let's look at the third one, and of course, relationships. Relationships are so important. They're such a fundamental part of the human experience that when we experience a trauma, especially some of those that we often see in the mental health side of things, whether it's a sexual abuse, whether it's an assault over here that we commonly hear about, relationships are no longer safe. And I know for me in my own traumatic experience, I went out of my way to keep relationships away from me, even when I didn't know it. See, and this is why the title of his book, The Body Keeps the Score, is brilliant and beautiful. Because whether you remember your trauma, whether you think it was a trauma, your body knows and your body keeps the score. So treating relationships is crucial to having a fulfilling life, having well-being with other people, and again, feeling safe. Because where can you go and avoid relationships? You cannot. You're always in a mode of relationality, if you will. So treating relationships helps treat the limbic system, helps treat safety and a sense of well-being overall. Now this, as you may think, talks about movement, because again, what happens in a traumatic event? The body keeps the score. And sometimes our bodies don't feel safe anymore. Sometimes we are dissociated from our bodies, and sometimes we may even blame our bodies for causing the trauma. This is just the way sometimes we think as a result of a traumatic event. When we look at communal rhythms and synchrony, we're talking about embodying the body of ourselves, of others, of getting on the same wavelength physically. And this again has incredible healing benefits, but specifically in the limbic system, as you begin to remember what it's like to be safe in your body and safe around other bodies. So there's a bunch of benefits from being able to engage in that type of limbic system therapy. The fifth limbic system therapy is getting in touch. Touch, as you may know, is one of the most essential features in the human experience because we experience right from the get-go, from little babies on up to adulthood. And that again is another area of our life that we lose and no longer feel safe. But we are effectively cut off from one of the most healing potentials, and that is touch. So how we return to touch, how we conceive touch, and how we respond to touch can be done in a therapeutic way. There's somatic types of therapies which engage different parts of the brain for different reasons. But the idea is we want to be able to feel touch, we want to be able to touch and experience life in all of its sensory experiences in a safe way again, but we need to treat the limbic system, and so treating that through getting back in touch is essential. The last of these limbic system therapies is about taking action, because effectively what happens when you experience a traumatic event is you lose agency. You lose the ability to take action in your own life. You lost control. You lost a sense of feeling like you're a competent, capable person. Helping a person restore the ability to take action is essential in treating therapy. But again, we need to be able to take action from that limbic system area of our brain so we know that it's safe to take action, that we can take action, and eventually want to restore those memories of taking action. So again, those are the 6 limbic system therapies. So now that we're making our way towards transformation, before we get to what is going to be our big payoff for this video, I first want to talk about a couple of other areas of treatment for trauma. I'm not going to go into too much detail in this video, but I want to make sure to acknowledge it and let you know in another video we will go into more depth. And those are brain tech treatments as well as the use of psychedelics. Now, when I'm talking about brain tech, I'm talking about deep brain stimulation, transcranial magnetic stimulation, and other forms of brain direct treatment. This may also include virtual reality, psychedelics. The best book out there right now is How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan, and that will give you the research and the science and some idea of how those interact with people with trauma. But I must say, under no circumstances am I recommending anybody take substances such as psychedelics. You do need to check in with your mental health professional. It can also be especially dangerous if you have trauma you're unaware of. You also may have personalities that don't do so well with disassociative types of substances for help, and other types of concerns are best taken up with your mental health professional. So while these therapies and treatments are promising, it is especially important that you always check in with a mental health professional before you take any substances of any kind for health and wellness. We are en route to post-traumatic growth because that is where transformation happens. And believe it or not, you can transform all your traumatic experiences into these 5 areas of post-traumatic growth. 1, personal strength. 2, new possibilities. 3, the cultivation of meaningful relationships. 4, spiritual change. And 5, appreciation for life. How might you experience personal strength as a result of post-traumatic growth? Let's go right back to the example that we've been working with throughout this entire video, and that is the person who has experienced a tree falling on their car. Part of the personal strength from post-traumatic growth, if that person has gone through those stages of recovery, found a helping professional, treated one or some of those limbic system therapies, a personal strength may be, well, now you can help other people, or maybe now you can get in any vehicle, or perhaps you're less afraid of experiences, and therefore it makes you even stronger about being an adventurous person. Now, let me share with you my example from my trauma. When I look at my personal strength, well, I can consider how I can help other people, or how I might be a better mental health professional as a result of the trauma I experienced, but more importantly, as a result of the transformation I experienced from my trauma and from my treatment. The second area, new possibilities. Sticking with the person that we've had our example with, what might be some new possibilities for a person that has healed and treated such trauma? Again, the world is open. They can go other places. Maybe other people's vehicles are no longer dangerous. Maybe, flying by air, which is, I guess, the only way to fly. But maybe that's another possibility. Because see, what would have happened is as you go through these and you realize you're safe in your body, you're safe in the environment, one of these transformative areas of new possibilities can just be that. There are possibilities out in the world. In my own case, new possibilities brought new relationships, new ways of behaving, and even new ways of talking about mental health and helping others. The third area, cultivating meaningful relationships. Some of your traumas may be experienced in places that weren't the best environments. For example, if you've dealt with substance use disorder, you may have found yourself in such environments. Maybe those relationships weren't so meaningful. However, now as you've healed from your trauma, you've treated that trauma, you can now begin to cultivate meaningful relationships. And what a beautiful opportunity that is. That is a huge area for post-traumatic growth because again, what does trauma do? It takes away our safety, and it takes away many times our relationships. And we may have not had the best relationships to begin with. So post-traumatic growth, cultivating meaningful relationships. Fourth, spiritual change. I'm also going to say existential change for those that may not be so comfortable with the word spiritual. But if you are spiritual or you are faith-based, or maybe you weren't before the trauma, and maybe it's because of that trauma you've now had a spiritual change, an existential awakening that connects you to this force in life, or it brings you closer to a faith-based community where you can begin to practice and benefit from those other areas of post-traumatic growth. So having a spiritual change and a sense of meaning is another area for your post-traumatic growth. And finally, that fifth area of post-traumatic growth is appreciation for life. Because let's face it, sometimes when we're dealing with PTSD, sometimes when we're dealing with traumas, it's hard to appreciate life because it seems like it's unfair, it's harmed us, maybe there's nothing worth seemingly out there for you in terms of goodness again. Because again, trauma distorts the way we not only experience the world, but the way we see the world. So when we look at healing that trauma and we think about appreciation for life, how might you begin to think about how appreciative you are? You know what? I know that happened to me, but thank goodness I'm alive, and now I can appreciate the moments I have more. Or perhaps like with my mother who had to go through cancer treatment. Her and I have a more appreciation for our time together because of that traumatic experience, which she's doing fine with now, but she did have to go through it, and we went through it as a family. And boy, that was a traumatic one because, as you know, that's my partner on this channel. As we go through that, her and I were able to have a deeper appreciation for life. And again, it's even playing a part in how we're doing these videos for you today. So those 5 areas of post-traumatic growth belong to you: personal strength, new possibilities, cultivation of meaningful relationships, spiritual change, and appreciation for life are all waiting for you.